Okay. So as I was saying that uh, the novel Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding is important because it is one of the very first novels. The story is important, the characters are important, the plot, the incidents that happen, they're all very important. But because, as I said, this is the earliest novel, one of the earliest novels, it is also important to see what the writer uh, thought about the genre of novel itself. Now, this was something that was new. Nothing like this had been attempted before. There were prose pieces, there were stories, there were narratives, but nothing of this form. See, literature always tells a story, but for almost as a rule, all these stories were written in a very poetic form because literature actually meant poetry. So unless you are able to use the language in a poetic form, people would not call it literature, you know, because language in day to day, I mean, the way you use language in day to day affairs, if you create literature also in that way, people thought, well, this is nothing special. So writers had to find a way to make their novels acceptable, uh, to tell people why any literature written in prose can be an acceptable and a decent form of literature. So, what Henry Fielding does, he gives you, he's one of the earliest theorists of novel. He theorizes what novel is. So, novel is important, as I said, but also important is the idea of Henry Fielding's. Now, his preface to the novel is very important, right? The preface is important because for the first time we find that a writer is trying to tell you the nature and scope of a novel. He is trying to tell you how a novel should be judged. He tells you what is the aim of a novelist. So these big questions about the novel as a genre is something that Henry Fielding addresses in his work. One very important thing that he says is that novel is a comic epic in prose, right? We know what an epic is, right? Since
Yes.
the ancient times, many people, many gifted poets had been writing epics. And all of these epics were basically long poems which talked about very serious ideas, very serious incidents. Many of them will be about great wars fought by warriors. So there'll be death, there'll be tragedy, and those kind of very elevated kind of human emotions. And of course, it will be written in verse. But what Henry Fielding is saying that now I'm writing an epic. I'm also writing an epic, but this is an epic in prose. And most important part is that this is a comic epic. This is not really a tragic epic. This is a comic epic, and it is written in prose. That's what novel is. He's calling it. Now, we should not confuse the word comic with funny. You know, comic is not funny. uh, Comic, when literature talks about it, when literary writers talk about it, when the critics talk about it, comic is basically life as it is lived by common men and women. You know, any writer, when he writes, he wants to represent his times or he wants to represent the society. What epics do, what the ancient writers did, that they wanted to show you a very specific segment, very specific slice of the society. They wanted to show you about the upper stratum of the society, the upper classes of the society, and their serious pursuits, right? But what a novelist does, a comic epic prose writer, he shows you the contemporary society in which the common people are living. Now he says that when I'm writing this comic epic in prose, I am showing you the lives of common people and the uh, the impression that we get when we look at their lives. Now he says that this comic does not mean that I'm trying to make fun of them. Comic does not mean that I'm parodying them. Comic doesn't mean that this is a burlesque. Now these are the words you should probably try. You may write them down and look them up in your glossary of literary terms. He says comic is not burlesque. You know, Burlesque, QUE, right? That's it's not a parody. It's not a travesty. Comic is basically how life actually is. What he says that in common day-to-day life, we tend to find ridiculous things. You know, in common human behavior, we find ridiculous things. Things that may sound us, look to us a little absurd and incongruous. And he says, why do things look incongruous to us? Why do things look strange to us and amuses us? Is because uh, source of ridiculous. Now that's another important word he brings. That the source of ridiculous is affectation. That's another word he adds, affectation. Uh, you know, and he says that basically there is this affectatious behavior that people have. You know, affectation is a word you will come across quite a lot in English literature. It is basically when people are trying to pretend to be something, you know, uh, when people are trying to be something or show themselves to be something that they are not. Sometimes, very, very deliberately, they try to exaggerate their qualities, you know. So, in simple terms, they try to show off. So, what Henry Fielding is saying is that in our literature, in comic, epic, and prose, I want to uh, show you the ridiculous. And this ridiculous comes from affectation. Affectation is when people try to uh, show off and pretend to be somebody. So out of that comes the ridiculous. Now he says that affectations also are of two types. There are two kinds of affectations. One affectation or two sources of affectation. One is vanity. That's another word that you must learn, and it's there in Henry Fielding. Vanity and hypocrisy. It says in vanity, people are basically trying to show off, exaggerate their qualities, their virtues. They want to show you, you know, in a very, very glittery light, uh, in a very positive light, they want to show you. So, and they want people to think very highly of them, you know. So they sometimes lie, sometimes they mislead people. But this vanity, you know, it's kind of still pardonable. But then there is another kind of affectation that comes from hypocrisy. And this is a worse kind of affectation because here, a hypocrite is a person who hides his shortcomings, his vices, his evil behavior, and tries to show off, pass off as a very nice and a gentle person. So, a literary writer, a comic writer, or comic epic writer, he observes these things in human behavior. He looks at the ridiculous. Ridiculous comes from affectation, and affectation, it comes from vanity and hypocrisy. Now, this is what he says that I'm trying to do in my novel. And this is what novelists must do, right? So he gives you a theory of the novel. And this is something that I want us to concentrate on. So even in this novel, you will realize that, the hypocrisy of slip slop is there, and sometimes vanity of all these people, sometimes vanity of people when Abraham Adam goes and meets people. So those things are um exposed, and out of these things, we recognize that this is the true state of the society, right? This is the true state of the society. So when a writer likes that, like that, when he shows you uh, this thing, uh, the ridiculous in human behavior, the comic aspect in human behavior, uh, like epics used to talk about the whole nation. For example, when there is a Trojan War between the Trojans and the Greeks, they're fighting. Then you see the whole character of their nation. Similarly, in novel, you see the whole character of the society, of the English society. So in that sense, also the canvas, the range of their work is also very wide. Okay, so these are a few things that he wants us to understand. Now that's you should try and read up more on this, and I may send you some material on this. But it's important to understand the theory of the novel. What is it that the novelists are trying to do? We also know that by exposing people's vices, by exposing people's this kind of affectatious behavior, we find that the novelist is also trying to reform the society. That's another aspect of the novel, the earliest novel. He is also trying to expose the society, but he's at the same time trying to reform the society. So that's another important thing that you may want to look at. Okay. The other aspects of this novel that we looked at were that this is a novel which comes also in the picaresque tradition. Picaresque tradition. Picaresques are basically stories and novels about one vagabond, a person who is not really of very high moral standards, but better than the rest of the society, right? So, like, he's a tramp who goes around the town and meets so-called respectable people, and then he shows us that these respectable people are not really that respectable. So for example, if you look at Charlie Chaplin movies, he's a tramp. He has this stick, this hat, and he goes around. He gets into different situations. He gets into a bakery or he gets into a factory, and he shows that how these people who are very well respected in the society are not really so kind-hearted or gentle-hearted. So he exposes the hypocrisy of the society. uh, you know Similarly, if you look at old Hindi films, in our films, man like Raj Kapoor, who is modeled on Charlie Chaplin, films like Avara, Shri 420. So he's a tramp, and he goes through different situations and he exposes the, you know, uh, so that's the picaresque tradition. So you have a man who himself is not of a very high moral standards, but his moral standards are still better than the society's. So this novel also falls into that picaresque tradition, and in this we find that, like as we talked about earlier, as Cervantes made Don Quixote, Henry Fielding has created character of Abraham Adams, Parson Adams, and Joseph Andrews, and these are the people who expose the shallowness, the expose the two-facedness and hypocrisy of their society. So picaresque tradition is another thing that we want to look at. One more thing that we need to look at is the digressions in this novel, right? The novel is basically, it's a story of uh, Joseph Andrews coming back to the village from London, and then the adventures on the road are there. But we see there are two, three places where suddenly we have a story. There is this Leonora and Horatio Bellarmine. There is this story going on that how this girl fell in love with somebody, but then there's somebody else who came. So those digressions are there. Then Wilson's story is there. Then later,
mm,
one of Abraham Adams' son, he starts telling a story. So these are digressions. And in modern times, people think that these digressions are basically the weak points of the novel, because a novel should be very unified, very integrated. It should not have unnecessary, digressions. It should not go into unnecessary directions. Uh,
mm,
so many people may fault this novel that it kind of experiments too much. But if we look back at the time, we know that this was a new genre, and as Henry Fielding was writing in the epic tradition, in epics we do have digressions. What happens? Epics are very long, so people sometimes want a some kind of breather, some kind of an interval, so that they can kind of distract themselves. So that novel played that role for them. I mean, those digressions fulfilled that need. So people could take their time off, take their mind off the main story, and look at something else. So that's one thing. Second thing is that this novel is basically about the uh, story on the road, and that too of more of a village. But yeah, your Henry Fielding also wanted to give us a glimpse of the degeneration of the upper classes in the cities. The
mm,
degeneration of upper classes in the cities. Now, in the novel, he could not do that much, except that he talked about Lady Booby and all that. But through
mm,
these digressions, he tells you the story of the degeneration and the you know of the city life. So this novel in that sense becomes a more holistic perspective on society, because he
mm,
not only talks about the rural area but also the London life. Okay, London, what happens, and how people are destroying their own lives, destroying the lives of other people because of their unrestrained passions, because of their love for money, material things. So those digressions help them. You know. So that's another important thing for us to read and realize, right?
mm,
Uh, so today, what I wanted to talk is basically these two things: uh,
mm,
the the theory of the novel as per Henry Fielding, and second is the digressions and the role they play. So otherwise, this novel, as I told you earlier, is also something like a Bollywood film. Like in Bollywood, there are many films where there is separation. बच्चा बचपन में बदल गया, बिछड़ गया,
mm,
and then there are all sorts of confusions take place, like a Manmohan Desai film, like Amar Akbar Anthony. So the
mm,
family kind of separates, and then in the end they all meet and get together. So
mm.
this is something that happens in this novel as well.
Yes.
Towards the end, when you come, you realize that Fanny and Joseph Andrews, they both want to marry, but
Mm,
somebody comes and tells, a peddler, a hawker, he comes and tells that, oh, this girl I had kidnapped from your family. So
mm,
they think that, oh, maybe Fanny and Joseph are brothers and sisters. So they are like, everybody is
mm,
very, very surprised, and they are kind of disheartened. But later we find that there is a mark on Joseph Andrews's
really.
body. So there is a strawberry
Mm,
mark, and then they realize that Wilson had said that his son had a mark who was kind of kidnapped by the gypsies. So
mm,
all things come out very well, and then you realize that Joseph actually is son of a very rich man, and
mm,
so he marries this poor girl Fanny. So that's how the story comes out, and it's a very, very Bollywood kind of a pot boiler. So novel
mm,
is very good, and there are a lot of discussions in this novel. At one point, uh, Henry Fielding, because he's a very erudite kind of a critic, you see that बीच में novel के what he does, he stops and discusses the art of the novel, discusses things about literary criticism. So sometimes he's discussing Aristotle's theory of poetics and all those things, and all of these things actually go on to make it a very very rich experience to read this novel. Okay, so in other few days, I mean, I had given you some summary and all those things. Just go through that, and one
Yes,
of these days we'll have a test on this, and
on this novel, sir.
on this novel. Okay, so
Yes, sir.
we'll do that. So you have taken one test. I'll give you.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have to finish by end of May, but we can take few
Mhm.
days in June also and try and finish all that. Okay, so
Yes, sir.
you've taken down some notes, and maybe I'll share this recording also with you. Okay,
Yes,
right then.
yes, sir.